Over the last few days, I've been shooting with the 50-150 f2 by Sony for some sports photography. So here are my thoughts. I took it to my tennis academy and I want to kind of talk a little bit of some points that I thought is some pros and cons when it comes down to using this lens for sports photography. Since I myself do a lot of portraits and sports photography, I wanted to share just that experience. First up is the autofocus when it comes down to using this lens with the Sony a7 IV. The autofocus seemed to be very reliable when it came down to using the Sony a7 IV paired up with the 50-150, even when shooting at f2. I used it with a lot of motion and as well with some obviously kind of stationary moments because I wanted to have the sharpness and also focus points where I could blur out the background with certain things, but I wanted to make sure that the autofocus would really land onto my subject. So I shot with continuous autofocusing with the tracking and everything so that when I would stick to a subject, which was one of my students, it would try to keep up with the autofocus to make sure that everything would just stay good and look really nicely without fail, which to be honest for the most part obviously worked out really great. The times where the focus wouldn't really nail is either the subject moved way out of the frame section where I had the focus point on, so it's more of a user error, not so much the lens in my opinion. But for the most part, it felt like it was really on the money when it came down to the movement of the subjects, while I was kind of spraying and praying with the shots so I could get as many shots as I could in focus, and especially to capture the movement as my students were moving around. Which honestly, as I was kind of just following along my subject, there was one moment where one of my students was kind of running across that I just kind of followed him and started taking as many photos as I could. I thought the autofocus worked great, especially with an older-ish camera like the Sony a7 IV. I could have used my updated a7C Mark II, but to me, I wanted to see how well the reliability of the autofocus of this newer lens would be with even an older camera, because maybe you have an a7 IV because you don't want to upgrade yet to maybe an a7R5 or a9 Mark III or whatever, because if you're buying this lens, probably have that budget, but still wanted to see how reliable it was and following along to see my subject just kind of move around and getting to just hold it down to really get those frames per second going through with the photos was really nice, and I was actually very happy with the results of that. So the overall reliability of the autofocus was pretty stellar. I really enjoyed it for sports photography. It really kept up with my subject, especially with the tracking. So far, so good. The next thing is the aperture shooting at f2 and why I loved it with this lens. One of the things of why I love shooting, for example, with my 35-150 that I'm filming on right now is that separation of the background with the bokeh with that f2 when I can do at 35 or right now 2.2 when I'm shooting at 50mm. So with using this lens to be able to shoot f2 consistently for that separation of the background or having nice bokeh or anything like that when using it for sports photography, because you want to, have the nice subject to be popping, it's super great. See, one of the things of why my 50-300, which is kind of the downfall of using it for sports photography, is having it of a slower aperture with like the 4.5 to 6.3, the more you zoom in. Having a consistent f2 has been rather nice to be able to see that separation of the subject versus the background, or if I want to, separate it from a student to the other. So it adds a little bit of mystery, but kind of, draws your eye into the image to showcase the subject a lot better. Especially when you have a not so exciting background, it's nice to be able to kind of blur it out a little bit with the photo, because now you're not so worried about the background kind of sucking. So you can kind of make the photo a little bit more interesting with the subject, because that's the focus, at least for me with sports photography, is the student doing what they're doing out on the tennis court, or if you do any other types of sports photography, whatever it is, you have that ability to just blur that background a little bit better if you're zooming into that 150 range, because it has the compression, it has the blurred background, so it gives you a little bit more to play with, which I found very exciting to use when it came down to this lens. And of course, the most obvious reason why this is nice to have for sports photography is having that zoom range from 50 to 150. You get to have enough wideness for the most part to be able to have those establishing shots or just showcasing a little bit more of what's happening within the sports world. Like for example, with my students, showcasing them playing against somebody else, so they have that 50 range, so it showcases the whole court, and be able to zoom in gradually to get more shots, whether it's at 70, 100, or the 150. I'm able to go ahead and add a variety of shots with a nicer, wider range with a little bit good telephoto range. So that made it a lot of exciting because I'm familiar with that with my 35-150. Now we have to share some cons when it came down to using this lens. The most obvious reason why this won't be the best sports photography lens is if you need the range. For example, with tennis, I get the access to be closer with the subjects because even being outside of the fence area as I took photos with the f2 was nice because it would just blur out the fence enough that I could get enough footage and photos and everything with just, being closer to the courts and the subject. But now if I was shooting maybe soccer, football, or baseball, this might not be the best lens if you're having to be in certain areas where you're not as close to the subject because of it not really being, there. You're gonna be further away from the subject, so it makes it a little bit harder to get the nice shots because unless you have maybe an A7R5 with the extra megapixels where you can crop in extra, not going to be the most ideal with, instead of using like a 50-300 or maybe the 200-600 depending what kind of range that you might need. But of course, if you're shooting indoors with like, let's say basketball or something that gives you a little bit more access, having the 50-150 range is nice, and as well having that f2 aperture because if you're indoors with having, not the nicest of lights, could be nice and beneficial to have that, faster aperture to get those shots. This lens also is not the best when it comes down to the weight because it is a chunkier lens, bigger lens, and I'm using my 35-150. So with having this bigger of a lens, obviously you're gonna have to use the little mount right here to put it on a tripod or monopod so that you can have a little bit more, stability when wanting to take your shots, because the other con that I don't really like, but I'm also used to, which is something that I wish even my 35-150 had, would be the vibration compensation or the OSS that the G Master lenses can have, like the 70-200. It adds a little bit more stability. So, with the weight of this, I would have hoped I would have had that because it would have been nice to have it for the price point, for the weight, and be able to get a little bit more stable footage or photos whenever you're doing in the more telephoto range. And lastly, obviously, if you need to be up close and personal to do for sports photography for whatever reason, the 50 is not gonna be wide enough. For me, 35 is a sweet spot because it's just wide enough for niceness when it comes down to, for example, my 35-150. It's just a lot nicer to have that wider range because you can't go wider, you can always crop in more. So having the 50mm range is gonna be a little bit not as enticing if you're needing to have a lot wider shots because maybe you're in the front lines of whether it's, let's say, basketball or anything indoorsy like that you have those, up closer shots. Might not be the most ideal, but at least, like if you need to have that zoom range, you'll have it, but that wider range would have been nicer to me. So some final thoughts to share when it came down to my experience with sports photography with this lens. For obvious reasons, it being a G Master lens, it's a great lens built. It has really good quality, sharpness, fastness, reliability, autofocus, and everything. So you're gonna get what you paid for it, which obviously is gonna be quite a bit of money because about $3,900 or whatever, it comes out to about $4,000 with taxes, depending where you're at. I would hope that you get what you paid for, but yeah, it is an expensive lens, but it has a good reason of why it needs to be that expensive. It's also been a fun lens to use, to be honest. I've been enjoying using it and testing it out, whether it's been for portraits, right now for sports photography, a lot nicer, but it's kind of funny because even with my students, they're like, oh, wow, that's a massive lens. And they've seen my 35-150. Once I even told them about the price point, they're like, holy crap, well, we better not hit it, kind of scenario, which I was thankful that they were very considerate in that aspect. So yay for them on that. But as much as I've enjoyed this lens, to be honest, with the price point, I personally can't see myself spending this much money on a lens like this due to the fact that it is a good lens if you're doing all this professional work that requires that f2 range and maybe more blurred backgrounds, and you're going to make your money's worth with this lens. So a lot of professionals will get it, don't get me wrong. This is not for the average user that is going to be just using it for fun, but for myself, it's just, I know it's a professional lens for work that might be needed, but even for me, I know I can get by with my other lenses like the Tamron because of the ranges that I need to have, especially for sports photography, and I'm okay with giving up that aperture. Do I wish we could have maybe a 2.8, 50-300? Of course, but at this point, I would honestly go with a 70-200 f2.8 by Sony, the G Master one, because you have OSS. So it gives you a little bit more stability. But yeah, that's just my thought when it came down to what I would want to for myself with the pricing and everything. I think it's an overall great lens, but to be honest, for me, the pricing is what's going to be the biggest factor on it. I don't know if it'll be $2,000 worth more than my 35-150, or maybe getting a 200-600 because I need the extra range, or the 70-200 even by Sony. It's just, there's a lot of pros and cons, and you really is going to be more up to what type of photo shoot for sports photography you're gonna be doing. For myself with tennis, I know for a fact that I need more of the range because depending at the tennis tournament, I might need the extra range. And having, for example, my Tamron 50-300, why I went for it, despite of it being a 4.5 to 6.3, is because I had a massive range from the 50-300 that gave me a lot more diversity when it came down to my photo shoots. Especially because if you compare it, obviously this one starts at 50, it's a lot tighter. I'm okay with that with tennis because 50 is fine for where I would have to take the photos, but even my 35-150 is nicer if I know I'm gonna be more up closer. But at the professional games where I don't get maybe a media pass or whatever, the 50-300 is just too good. This would need to have more range for me to be really wanting to spend that much money for a consistent, aperture of f2, despite of it being an amazing lens. So you'll have to decide, is this lens worth for sports photography, or is there something else that you think is more the money, specs to ratio that would make more sense? I would love to know your idea of when it comes down to this lens, if it's something that you would be willing to pick up for sports photography, because maybe the f2 aperture is something that you're needing for maybe faster, shots or anything like that, or are you wanting to get something else, or do you have something else that makes more sense? Leave a comment down below. I would love to know your thoughts when it came down to that, because maybe it'll help out other people, but it could help out myself as well to look at other lenses that can make sense to pair up for sports photography. Because like I said, I think it'll be a great lens if you're needing more of the low light capabilities, maybe being inside a gym, maybe being at a, whether it's for workouts gym or with maybe basketball, volleyball, or something that's indoors with the more artificial lights or something like that, maybe. So yeah, we'd love to know your thoughts when it comes down to that. So don't forget to leave a comment down below. But with all that said and done, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to like and subscribe, share this video with a friend. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya.